This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we of course just watched as House Republicans push through their budget, and the top lines from this budget are especially dangerous. The fact that we have almost 14 million people who are going to be stripped of their health care through Medicaid. We have $300 million being stripped away from food assistance for those who need it most. But buried deep in this bill was something that you just brought up to me. Can you explain what it was? Because this isn't something that's been publicized at all, but it can have major ramifications moving forward.
Yeah, so if you care about stopping Donald Trump's authoritarianism and you care about protecting democracy through the courts, you need to be paying attention to this because this is a blockbuster provision buried deep, as you say, in this bill. It was not something that was highlighted, but boy, does it have the fingerprints of Donald Trump's administration or his MAGA supporters all over it. What it basically will do is invalidate, declare null and void in practice all of the ability of federal judges to hold the administration in contempt for violating their existing injunctive orders. In other words, every time a federal judge has said, hey, Donald Trump administration, you can't do this, and then they do it, and a judge says, hey, we may hold you in contempt for it, they won't be able to hold them in contempt because the plaintiffs in that case didn't put money in the court as this new law would require. And this is a shot directly at the pro-democracy movement.
At this point, we're seeing all of these federal judges. We're seeing so many federal judges basically impose injunctions or block a lot of these efforts that the Trump administration is trying to move forward. And really, the only recourse that we have is the ability to hold these Trump administration officials in contempt. Even in the instance where they decided to illegally deport Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the only recourse that we have right now is the prospect of contempt proceedings moving forward. And so what would this look like in terms of being able to hold the administration accountable for when they defy the courts?
So I think you have found what the Trump administration would consider to be the feature, not the flaw, right?
Right.
The whole point here is that what they're saying is that an injunction that is in place, you cannot find contempt against the administration for disregarding it. In other words, if they go out and violate a court order, judge, you can't find them in contempt unless you had required the plaintiffs to post what is called a bond, which is to basically put some money in the possession of the court so that if ultimately the injunction is dissolved, if ultimately it turns out that the plaintiffs are wrong, the government gets compensated for its inconvenience. Judges never do this in cases involving injunctions against the government. This is an old provision that's been around so that if two private companies sue each other, one company wins and they have to post money so that if they ultimately lose, they compensate the other one. But when it comes to the government, this is not a thing that's put in place. But what they're doing here is they're saying, because no one has posted a bond, the courts cannot spend any of their own money to enforce enforce contempt, which means no contempt.
So what would the deterrent effect be if the administration opts not to comply with a court order?
Well, I mean, therein lies it. I mean, we could go back to, I could say the word norms, but that would probably lead to ridicule, as it should. We have been too long in the pro-democracy movement, not well served by too many people worried about norms. And so the fact is, Donald Trump's not going to abide by court orders unless he is compelled to do so. We've had a lot of debate in this show and elsewhere about whether or not, even with the threat of contempt, they would comply with court orders. But without that threat, why would they comply? They won't. But, what it's going to require is all of these judges to now reissue their orders and require a posting of a bond by these public interest groups, which will be a financial hardship from those groups having to post this money. And there'll be all kinds of appeals about the amount of money, and that takes a lot of time. And in the meantime, you've got Donald Trump as an administration, finding new places around the world to find gulags to ship people. But it's not just the immigration cases. There's an interesting sidebar to this, which is that Jim Jordan, the Republican member of Congress, incorrectly said, now whether he was incorrect because he was lying or incorrectly because he was misinformed, he said, oh, don't worry, this only applies to immigration cases involving nationwide injunctions. No, it doesn't. It applies to everything. And so this is not just about immigration, if you worry about the doing away with, federal workers, you need to care about this. If you care about the defunding of NIH and the various health agencies, you need to care about this. If you worry about the restructuring and the dissolution of departments and agencies, you need to care about this. This is a big, big deal and is going to make the job of fighting against Donald Trump and the administration more costly and more complicated.
I understand that each branch can serve as a check on the other branch, but I mean, is this a situation where basically the legislative branch, and once Trump signs it into law, the executive branch are able to water down the power of the judicial branch to then serve as a check on the executive branch? I mean, in a way, I understand that this is the system working as it should, because one branch, in this case, the legislative branch, should be able to serve as a check on the judicial branch, but only in the instance where the judicial branch is actually being abusive. This is actually a step in the other direction where the executive branch wants to be abusive, and so the judicial branch is giving them carte blanche to do that by clipping the wings of the judicial branch.
Yeah, so a couple of things. Number one, let's be clear. The legislative branch is not doing this to protect the legislative branch, right? I mean, like the legislative branch has no dog in this fight. The only reason why you see the Congress stepping in here is to facilitate Donald Trump's ascension to be king-like, right? So this is not really a separation of powers issue, because the legislature, in this case, Republicans in Congress, are not protecting their prerogatives. It's not like they are confronting a problem in which judges are holding individual senators in contempt and they are trying to protect legislative power. They're doing this simply to immunize further Donald Trump from whatever limited oversight that the courts can provide. That's number one. Number two, I think that you put your finger right on the question, which is, how do the judges respond? How does the judicial branch respond? My own view is that judicial contempt is an inherent power of the judiciary, and it cannot be checked by the legislature, and it cannot be checked by the executive branch. It is inherent power that you need to have as a judge to enforce your own orders, because otherwise, as you point out, you have made the orders of the court unenforceable by the courts themselves. So to me, I think what the federal judges ought to do is say, that's fine that you passed this law. That law is unconstitutional, and therefore we don't have to abide by it. Now, will that happen? I don't know. Should they? Yes. But, Brian, it is moments like this that I am reminded of your admonition about the legislative branch. We just watched, literally, the day before we are recording this, we watched as the Republicans decided that, notwithstanding the ruling of the parliamentarian in the Senate about something being in order or not, they were going to overrule the parliamentarian. Right. And so, again, I feel like you and I keep having this conversation about, well, does the legislative branch have to follow the rules of the legislative branch? And the answer is yes, except, as you point out, maybe not. Does the judicial branch have to follow the rules that are laid out, or can they strike them down? Right. Well, they could strike them down. I mean, they are the ultimate arbiter of what is constitutional or not. But I feel like this is playing right into the exact dilemma that you have identified about the parliamentarian.
Right. I mean, in a way, it's just like the pro-democracy faction will try to good governance itself into obscurity. And knowing full well that the right will never do that. The right will always say, forget the parliamentarian. If the parliamentarian says something that we don't agree with, we just barrel through the parliamentarian, pretend that the parliamentarian doesn't exist. But the left won't do that. And so Republicans rely on that asymmetry to be able to consolidate power for themselves.
Which I think here means that we very well might see the courts abide by this with Trump. And then at some point we'll have a Democratic president.
Yeah.
And what will happen then is some right-wing group will file a lawsuit and not post a bond. Yeah. And it will say, oh, wait, that thing? No, that was always unconstitutional.
Right. You had mentioned that the power of contempt is an inherent power for the judicial branch to be able to protect its rulings. And so that will likely be, if that's challenged by this administration, the courts are the arbiters of these things. And so will we see a situation where the court says no, the executive branch says yes, and the court says, okay, well, let's bring this to the court. We're the court, we say no, that's it.
So this is my point. That's why I compare it to the parliamentarian situation, because ultimately the entity that gets to make this decision about whether this provision is or is not constitutional will be the courts themselves.
Yeah. And so it's just a matter of whether they are actually willing to have the spine to stand up for their own power, or if they think that it's some instance of good governance and we have to allow the executive branch to check the judicial branch, and so we're just going to lay down for even what is an unconstitutional order because we don't want to give the optics that we're consolidating too much power for ourselves.
Right. And I think what you will also see is that you'll see a lot of courts that say, look, fine, I have to impose a bond. I'll impose a $1 bond, and that'll be that. And the Trump administration will challenge that, and that will get litigated. And meanwhile, all throughout all of this, you're not going to have contempt moving forward because there's going to be this uncertainty, and the judges are going to feel like, well, until that uncertainty is settled. So this provision is a really, really big reason. And it's a reason why, I want everyone watching this, like, this is why Brian and I do this. This is why we started Democracy Watch, because, oftentimes oftentimes what's going on in politics that is what you're focusing on is the main issue. And there are some really big issues in this bill, like some huge issues in this bill. It is going to gut healthcare for millions and millions of the neediest Americans. It is going to undermine the ability of our government to provide and to protect Americans. It is going to give more and more tax cuts to the richest of the rich of the rich. And it's going to raise borrowing costs for people who have car loans and student loans and home mortgages. So there's lots in this bill that is terrible. And there is lots in this bill that you need to be educated on. So I'm not telling you not to be. But the reason why Brian and I do this series specifically is because you also need to know that these things have impacts on democracy, that these things will also impact our ability to stand up and fight back against the growing authoritarianism. So I want to thank you, Brian, for starting this series with me and for us continuing to focus on these things.
Well, I appreciate that. And look, I think that this is especially important too, because these are the little details that don't get mainstream media coverage because it's not, it doesn't have to do with Joe Biden's cognitive decline, first and foremost, so it's not going to get much coverage this week, but also because this is the stuff that's the minutia that will eventually play some huge role. But for right now, Republicans really benefit from being able to do this stuff under the cloak of darkness. They benefit from being able to do this stuff with some degree of obscurity. And so I think it's important, and grateful for you being able to bring this issue to the spotlight here. And I know that you're also doing that with your new YouTube channel. So highly recommend for everybody who's watching right now, if you want to support Mark and his team and the work that they're doing, especially getting these issues into the spotlight here, please make sure to subscribe to Democracy Docket. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Highly recommend that you watch that content, let it bubble up in the algorithm so that not just you, but other people have the opportunity to see it too. That's how we grow this progressive media ecosystem. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.